Okay, this is Block 8, Pax Americana, Section 2, the Cold War, with the section beginning, the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is one of the glories of American 20th century foreign policy. After World War II, the destruction in Europe was nearly total. Germany was prostrate. France had been sucked dry. The Soviet Union had been physically decimated. English cities had been bombed. Economic despair, and millions of men had been killed. Economic despair ate at the heart of the democratic nations of Western Europe: Italy, Greece, France, Britain. The physical damage of the war had been immense, and even in parts of Germany in 1945-1946, there was honest-to-God hunger and near starvation. In this chaos, communism thrives. The economic theory of communism and of taking means of production away and giving it to workers thrived, especially in France and Italy in the years immediately following the Second World War. And what good, Americans kind of reasoned, hey, what's the good of defending Europe from Soviet communists if they're just going to go become communists on their own? They would be voted into power for taking advantage of the economic hard times. President Truman did not want to see that happen. And in the world's only remaining wealthy country, he went in 1947 to Harvard University and gave the graduation speech, the commencement address. Truman gave it at Harvard in 1947. And what he did is he said something to the Europeans that will resound right through today. He said, if you guys, you European nations, if you guys can come up with a joint plan for economic recovery, not a French plan, not a British plan, not an Italian plan, not a Greek plan for Greece, an Italian plan for Italy, a German plan for Germany, a French plan for France. He said, if you all get together and come up with a united, a joint plan, then the United States will provide substantial financial assistance. The Europeans jumped at this, and this cooperation became the basis for what would be called the European Community, the EC, which would in time become the EU, the European Union. Very early on, the European countries presented to the United States this plan for economic recovery, and then the United States opened the floodgate of aid. Very substantial aid. It was formerly known as the European Recovery Program, but everybody except for General Marshall himself called it the Marshall Plan. It's named after General Marshall because General Marshall was President Truman's Secretary of State. He was called the architect of the victory of World War II. He was Roosevelt's most important soldier, and he became Truman's Secretary of State, responsible for the giving out of all of this American largesse. Everybody called it the Marshall Plan, except for Marshall. He was a modest guy. He called it by its official name, the European Recovery Program. And in this Marshall Plan, which is what we're going to call it, in this Marshall Plan, European countries provided over $12.5 billion in loans and grants over 4 years to 16 cooperating nations. $12.5 billion in loans, $12.5 billion in grants to help rebuild the European economy. The Soviet Union was invited to participate. Truman offered American aid to the Soviets as well, but he also demanded that the Soviets kind of open up their economy, reform their system, and change communism within the Soviet Union. Stalin, of course, refused to consider this. He considered it another fascist imperialistic trick, and Stalin refused Marshall Plan aid that was offered to him. This is presented to Congress in 1948, and Congress looks at the amount and says, whoa, $12.5 billion of American taxpayer money to rebuild Germany, Italy, France, England? I don't know about that. But events in Czechoslovakia, which we are going to describe shortly, forced their hand, and after a few weeks of debate, Congress approved the Marshall Plan, and American money and American gifts began flowing into Western Europe.